Hello, welcome to Davenport Public Library's presentation of bedtime stories. I am Nonna Angie, and we will be reading from the Illustrated Grimm's Fairy Tales. This was published by Usborne, and they have granted us permission to read this to you today. The story that we're going to be reading today is called The Elves and the Shoemaker. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to show you the picture. This book is so beautifully illustrated. So here we go. The Elves and the Shoemaker. A poor shoemaker gave a deep sigh. Since the big shoe factory opened up in town, people had stopped coming to his little shop. With business so bad, the shoemaker couldn't afford to buy any more leather. Now there was just enough to make one more pair of shoes. Carefully, he cut out the shapes of the shoes and he laid the pieces on the workbench. "I'll sew them together tomorrow," he said wearily, and then, with a heavy heart, he went up to bed. When the shoemaker came downstairs in the morning, he rubbed his eyes in disbelief. Lying there on the workbench was a perfect pair of finished shoes. "I wonder how they got there," he wondered. He picked up the shoes and he stared at them. The stitches were the tiniest that he'd ever seen, and every single one was as neat as could be. "How strange," he said, shaking his head. "I must still be dreaming." "Dreaming about what?" asked his wife, popping her head around the door. The shoemaker told her what had happened, and she was just as puzzled as he was. But they put the shoes in the window and in pride of place. A few minutes later the bell rang, and in walked an elegantly dressed gentleman. "I would like to try on those magnificent shoes," he said. "Certainly, sir," said the shoemaker. He and his wife bustled around. It was their first customer in a very long time, and they were eager to please him. Want to see the shoes? They're pretty fancy. The shoes were a perfect fit, and it was as if they were made for him. "I'll take them," he declared, and he paid for them at once. With the money, the shoemaker was able to buy leather for 2 more pairs of shoes. That evening, he cut out the shapes of the new shoes, but after all the excitement, he was exhausted. "Why don't you finish them in the morning?" suggested his wife. "Good idea," said the shopkeeper, and he and his wife went happily to bed. The next morning, the shoemaker found 2 pairs of newly made shoes waiting for him. They had crisscross ribbons. They were decorated with sparkly sequins. "Goodness me," he exclaimed. "They're even better than the first pair." No sooner had he put them in the window than they caught the attention of 2 sisters who were passing by. Now these sisters adored shoes. They had 100 pairs each already, but none were as beautiful as these. In any case, they firmly believed that you could never have too many shoes. They stood for a moment, drooling over them. "We have to have them," gushed the first sister. "They're simply divine." "No doubt about it," agreed the second. "We can't live without them." Here's the first guy. That's the guy who bought that first pair of shoes. Without further delay, they marched inside. "We'd like to try on those shoes in the window," they announced. "Certainly, ladies," said the shoemaker. "Give me a moment." By the time he turned around with the shoes, the 2 sisters were already waiting in their stockinged feet, wiggling their toes in anticipation. They slipped the shoes on and they shrieked with excitement, and then they sprang to their feet and teetered around the workshop, giggling and doing little twirls. There they are. The money the sisters paid was enough for the shoemaker to buy leather for 4 more pairs of shoes. He cut out the shapes just as before, and then he and his wife went to bed. By morning, you guessed it, there were 4 pairs of newly made shoes lined up on the workbench. They had towering heels and were embroidered all over with intricate patterns. The shoemaker gazed at them admiringly, and then he wandered over to the window and opened the blinds. He almost jumped out of his battered boots with shock. A crowd of people had gathered, their noses pressed right up against the glass, and as soon as he opened the door, they barged past, bashing with their handbags and poking with their umbrellas and elbowing with their elbows. 4 lucky customers snatched up the shoes. "We want shoes! We want shoes!" chanted the others impatiently. "Hold on," cried the shoemaker's wife. "There'll be more shoes tomorrow." The next day, customers were lined up all the way around the corner. And so it went. Every night, the shoemaker cut out the leather, and every morning new shoes were waiting. There were shoes with buckles and shoes with bows. There were knee-high boots with pointy toes, clippity clogs and dainty slippers, dancing pumps and winkle pickers. I don't know what winkle pickers are. For a long time, the shoemaker and his wife didn't dare speak about what had happened in case their good fortune came to an end. Here's all the shoes. Which ones do you think are winkle pickers? Maybe these? I don't know. I'm guessing. And then one evening, as they were closing up the workshop, the shoemaker's wife asked, "Who do you think is helping us?" "I've been wondering the same thing," said the shoemaker. "Let's stay up tonight and see." So that night, instead of climbing the stairs to bed, they hid themselves in the next room and they waited to see what would happen next. Just as the clock struck midnight, the door swung open and 2 little people, no higher than a shoemaker's knee, ran in. They were dressed in raggedy clothes and their feet were bare. "Of course, elves," whispered the shoemaker excitedly. "I should have guessed from those tiny stitches." The elves climbed onto the workbench and set to work at once. The shoemaker and his wife watched in amazement as their needles flew in and out, flashing like little lightning bolts. There's the elves. In no time at all, the 2 elves had made a beautiful pair of shoes. They hammered on the soles with a rat-tat-tat and polished the shoes until they shone. Then quickly moved on to the next pair and the next and the next. The busy little elves didn't stop until they had used up every single piece of leather. Only then did they stand back to admire their work. "You know, I think these are even better than Cinderella's shoes," said one. "I quite agree," replied the other. "Glass slippers are very pretty and all that, but these are much more comfortable." Looking rather pleased with themselves, the elves jumped down from the workbench. They slipped out through the open door. "Ah, poor little things," said the shoemaker's wife when they'd gone. "Did you see their tattered clothes? We should make them some new ones to say thank you." "What a splendid idea," said her husband. "I can't wait to see their faces." You want to see their clothes again? There's the elves. There's the elves in their tattered clothes and their bare feet. And here is the new clothes that the shoemaker's wife made them. Early the next morning, the 2 of them set to work. The shoemaker's wife sewed 2 neat little shirts, 2 handsome pairs of trousers, 2 stylish waistcoats, and 2 tiny pointed hats. Meanwhile, the shoemaker cut out the pieces for 2 pairs of elfin boots and began to stitch them together. It was fiddly work, but he put his heart and soul into it. The boots were made of shiny red leather with turned-up toes and dainty golden bells all around the top. By the time the shoemaker had finished, his eyes ached and his fingers bled. "I do hope they like them," he said anxiously. That night, the shoemaker and his wife laid the clothes and boots out on the workbench. They hid in the corner of the workshop to wait for the elves. When midnight chimed, the elves raced in, ready to start work. But instead of leather, they found 2 little piles of clothes. With squeals of delight, they pounced on their new outfits and they put them on. "Look at that handsome fellow," exclaimed one of the elves, admiring himself in the mirror. The other elf chuckled. "Oh, We're much too elegant to work now, he said. I think our cobbling days are over. And then he noticed the boots. Oh, look, he gasped. Do you think they're for us? Well, I can't see them fitting anybody else around here, can you? Teased his friend. The shoemaker held his breath as the elves examined the boots. They turned them over and looked at them every which way. Magnificent, declared the first elf at last. What fine workmanship. Quite extraordinary, agreed the second. I had no idea humans were so talented. They slipped their feet into the boots and they clicked the heels together. And then they started to dance. They did a little jig along the workbench and they turned cartwheels across the floor and they skipped right out of the workshop door with their golden bells jingling merrily. The shoemaker looked at his wife and smiled. I think they're happy customers. Here they are. That was the last they saw of their little helpers. But it wasn't the end of the fairy tale. The shoemaker continued making beautiful shoes, and he always had plenty of customers. He and his wife were never poor again. That was a very, very sweet story. Okay, be sure and join us next time for Bedtime Tales at the Davenport Public Library.